she whispered. "End it fast." The words trembled from her lips as the rain poured over the deserted road, cold drops mixing with the dirt and blood that streaked her face. The bikers circled her like vultures, their engines growling and echoing through the night, the smell of gasoline and fear thick in the air. One of them laughed harshly, the sound sharp and cruel against the wind. She didn't flinch. Her hands shook, but her eyes stayed steady, tired, and full of something deeper than fear. Something that even they couldn't understand. Yet one biker reached out to grab her, to pull her shirt as if to assert his control. But in that moment, the world seemed to pause. A small silver locket slipped from her neck and hit the ground with a soft metallic sound. It opened, and two small faces stared up from inside. Two children, smiling wide, innocent, and unaware of the darkness their mother was facing alone on that empty road. The laughter died. The biker froze. He looked at the pictures, then at her. The rain fell harder, and the engine suddenly sounded too loud, too alive, in a moment that felt like it should have been silent. The woman's lips parted. "Again, please," she said quietly, her voice breaking like glass under pressure. "If you must take something, take the debt, not my kid's future." Her words were simple, but they cut through the noise, the thunder, the arrogance, and the anger. They hit the leader hardest. His gloved hand tightened on his handlebars. In the flash of lightning, he saw his own reflection in the puddle near her feet, and it wasn't the man he used to be. It was someone hollow. Then his eyes caught the faces in the locket, and for a brief second, he saw his daughter's smile there. Instead, the rain blurred his vision. But it wasn't just rain anymore. The others waited for his order. Unsure what was happening, she looked up at him, and something in that look, the mixture of despair, strength, and a mother's quiet defiance, tore through him like a knife. His throat felt tight, words choking behind the weight of memories he had long buried. The storm roared overhead, and he finally whispered, almost to himself, "We're ending this another way." They left her there, not in cruelty, but in silence. One of them threw his jacket over her shoulders before starting his bike. No one spoke. The engines revved, the thunder rolled, and the gang disappeared into the night, leaving her in the middle of the road with her locket pressed to her chest. The rain kept falling, washing away the blood and fear, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry, not from terror, but from the fragile hope that maybe she would get another chance. Days passed, and she drifted between exhaustion and disbelief. The world felt heavier, but somehow kinder. One morning, she woke in a hospital bed. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, and for a moment, she couldn't remember how she had gotten there. Nurse entered with a soft smile and said she had been found by a passing truck driver. Unconscious, but alive. There was something else, too. An envelope left by someone who refused to give his name. Inside was her house deed, cleared of debt, and a note with a single sentence, "A mother's love is the only thing worth owing." She held that note close, tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't know why or how, but she knew it had come from them. From him. Outside the hospital window, a man stood watching the biker leader, helmet tucked under his arm, scars visible beneath the rain-soaked light. He didn't come inside. He didn't need to. He had already said what mattered in the note. Behind him, his brothers waited by their bikes, quieter men now, carrying the weight of what they had done and the strange redemption they had found in a single night's mercy. They didn't talk about it. Some left the gang. Others stayed just long enough to make sure no one else suffered the way she had. They had been changed, not by guilt, but by recognition. That woman's courage had reminded them who they once were, who they could be again. Weeks later, when she returned home, her two children ran into her arms, their laughter filling the small house like sunlight after a storm. She held them tightly, burying her face in their hair, breathing in the life she had almost lost. She didn't tell them everything. She didn't speak of the road, the bikers, or the way one man's eyes had softened in the lightning's glow. She just told them that there are people in the world who lose their way, who forget what love means, but sometimes, something or someone reminds them. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the kindest changes. At night, when the house was quiet, she would sit by the window with the locket in her hand. The faces of her children smiled up at her, safe and warm, and she would whisper a prayer for the men who had once terrified her. Somewhere out there, she believed, they were finding their own way back. Maybe the leader had gone home to his daughter. Maybe he was holding his own kind of locket, remembering what it meant to be a father. She didn't need to know. It was enough that they had chosen mercy, and though her body still carried the scars of fear and struggle, her heart began to heal. She had been broken and rebuilt by love. Hers and theirs. Redemption, she realized, wasn't something you asked for. It was something you gave, even to those who least deserved it. Because sometimes that's how the cycle ends, not with revenge, not with pain, but with a single act of grace on a rain-soaked road. When one person whispers, "End it fast," and another chooses to say, "No." Let's begin again. Weeks later, she woke in a hospital bed, her breath shallow and her body wrapped in quiet pain. The ceiling lights above her flickered softly, and for a moment, she couldn't tell if she was still dreaming. The last thing she remembered was the rain, the roar of engines, and the sound of her own voice trembling in the storm. Then there was silence. Merciful, endless silence now. The hum of machines and the faint beeping of a heart monitor replaced that chaos. A nurse entered the room, her face kind and calm, and told her she had been found unconscious on the roadside. "You're safe now," the nurse said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. Safe. It was a word she hadn't felt in years. Her eyes drifted to the side table, where an envelope rested beside a folded piece of paper and something that looked like a document with shaking hands. She opened. It inside was her house deed, cleared, stamped, and signed. The debt that had haunted her, that had pushed her into the darkest corners of fear, was gone. Completely gone. Her tears came fast, unfiltered and raw, rolling down her cheeks as she pressed the papers to her chest. There was also a note, handwritten, rough but careful, the letters curved like someone who wasn't used to writing anymore but wanted to be understood. Read, "You reminded us who we were before the leather and rage. Tell your kids we're sorry." She read it again and again, her mind trying to piece together what it meant somewhere. Outside the hospital window, a shadow stood by the glass, a man, helmet under his arm, eyes filled with something heavy. It was the biker leader. He didn't move, didn't knock, didn't enter. He simply stood there for a long moment, watching her, his breath fogging the glass slightly. Before he turned away, behind him, she could almost see the outline of other men waiting with their bikes, the same men who had once circled her like wolves, but now they stood differently, quiet, uncertain, maybe even free. She realized then that something had shifted that night, not just for her, but for them too. They had walked away from their old lives, leaving behind the noise, the anger, and the endless road that led nowhere. Maybe they didn't know where they were going, but at least they weren't lost in the same darkness anymore. Days turned into weeks, and she slowly began to heal. The bruises faded, but the memories lingered, not as nightmares, but as reminders of how close she had come to losing everything, and how strangely mercy had found her when she least expected it. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the window, she heard familiar laughter outside her door. Her heart skipped. Her children rushed in, their small feet pattering on the linoleum floor, their arms wrapping tightly around her. She held them with all her strength, her tears falling into their hair. They were safe. That was all that mattered. "Mommy, are you okay?" her daughter asked, her big eyes full of worry. She nodded, forcing a smile, brushing a strand of hair away from her daughter's face. "I'm okay, baby, I'm here now." She didn't tell them the full story. She didn't tell them about the road, the fear, or the men who had chosen to show her compassion when they didn't have. She just said that sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes good men lose their way, but love, real love, can remind them where home is. The children didn't understand it fully, but they smiled and hugged her tighter, as if love itself was enough to make sense of everything. That night, as she lay in her bed at home for the first time in months, she listened to the soft breathing of her kids asleep. In the next room, the house was old, the walls thin, but it was hers again. Safe, warm, alive. The locket lay on her bedside table, open to the same picture of her children. She reached out, traced their faces with her fingertip, and whispered a quiet thank you to the night far away, on a quiet highway under a blood-orange sunset. The biker leader rode alone. His brothers had scattered, each one trying to start over. He carried the weight of the past on his shoulders, but it felt lighter somehow in his pocket. He kept a small, crumpled photograph, a copy of the same locket picture he had picked up that night from the wet road. Before handing it back to her, he looked at it whenever guilt clawed at him. Whenever he doubted whether a man like him could ever change, it reminded him that redemption doesn't erase what's been done, but it gives you a chance to live differently afterward. That was enough. Back at home, she began rebuilding her life piece by piece. She took on small jobs, cooked dinner for her kids, and learned how to smile again without forcing it. Sometimes at night, when she walked outside to breathe under the stars, she would hear the faint echo of motorcycle engines somewhere in the distance. It didn't frighten her anymore. Instead, it filled her with a strange peace. Maybe it was him. Maybe he was still out there, riding through the dark, trying to make things right in his own way. She hoped so, because in a world so full of pain and mistakes, believing that people could change was the only way to. Keep living with an open heart. Years later, when her children were grown, they found that old locket in a drawer and asked her about it. She smiled softly, her eyes distant but warm. That, she said, is the reason we still have this home. They didn't press further. They could see in her expression that the story carried both pain and grace, and in the quiet of that evening, she looked out the window again, remembering the man who had once stood outside that hospital glass, silent, rain-soaked, but human again. She never saw him after that day, but somehow, she knew he found his way back to his daughter. She imagined her grown now, maybe sitting at a table somewhere, hearing stories of a father who once made a choice that changed everything. Life, she learned, wasn't about escaping the storms. It was about finding the strength to stand in them, and the courage to forgive those who once caused them. And though the road that led her there was dark and filled with fear, it ended with a lesson that would live forever in her heart. Redemption doesn't always come with grand gestures or apologies spoken aloud. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of an envelope left by a stranger, a cleared debt, and a whisper in the rain that says, without words, love can still lead us home.